Enjoy a seat at the table and good company, where great conversations and meaningful discussions happen.
Welcome to And Good Company. I'm Sarah Fiedelholtz, a conversationalist. We all know a great dinner party isn't really about the food. It's about the people seated around the table engaging in lively discussion. And Good Company creates a way to capture smart and important conversations as they happen. I am pleased to be again in the company of Zach Benedict, who is a principal at MKM Architecture and Design. Welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
Because we have still so much more to talk about because of the idea, this whole idea about how well-designed places create the connectivity and how it improves the well-being, and also thinking about how we can reshape our spaces. Mm-hmm. And I really wanted to focus on, although you're an architect, I refer to you as my Renaissance man.
Yeah.
But because you have this, I think, unquenchable curiosity for everything. But this idea of your interest in urban sociology, mm-hmm. and how you sort of apply those kinds of aspects to your work in the architecture and design field. So I wanted to start with this whole idea of taking a look at this understanding of neighborhoods, mm-hmm. and what it means to have a successful and vibrant neighborhood. Because one of the things that I was surprised about is that in Fort Wayne, we have 300 neighborhoods, but there's no real sense of identity to them.
Yeah.
And, there's no, I have this old personal sort of soapbox issue about talking about things about sides, like the north side, the south side, and how we really should look at neighborhoods. But then the issue of this whole idea of diversity and inclusivity. So I wanted to take a step back and, from your perspective, sort of look at the neighborhood and the important role that it does play, mm-hmm. and is going to continue to play as we look for new redevelopment of areas, or like in the case of Southeast Fort Wayne, they just talking about a huge new development. And have we thought about the aspects of what it makes into be a good neighborhood in what we're doing in some of those developments?
It's tough. I always try to think of a neighborhood of people in the similar way I would think of a school of fish or a colony of ants. That tends to be the scale of camaraderie we're genetically meant to interact within, that kind of that framework. And I think the complexity comes from, in evolutionary terms, the recent shift away from localized communication, mm-hmm. to virtual communication.
Okay.
And the geographic limits of our community now have been blurred to these virtual networks of friends, that have no geographic requirement. And that has made this idea of neighborhood development extremely difficult, I think.
Uh-huh.
We are hardwired to embrace group identities. It's all the way back from being hunter-gatherers. Your survival was based on your association with a group.
So like that was your tribe.
Correct. And you're not going to just overnight replace 1 million years worth of evolution.
Right.
So you can see that hunger or desire to associate with the groups in everything from social media to political affiliations. Like we crave that group identity. But for centuries and up till recently, part, if not the largest portion of that group identity was your geographic neighborhood, your city, mm-hmm. your community, your neighborhood. And we need to reteach ourselves how to prioritize and incentivize that connection to the local geography of which we live, while still competing in a global market. And that's where it gets complex.
Well, it also gets complex because you talk about technology, and in some ways, technology can be used in a good way to help from a grassroots level, like from neighborhood watch associations or having a hyper-local newsletter for your neighborhood and things like that. but it can also be to our detriment because we don't have that face-to-face or connection with people because we have this false sense of community and these friends.
Correct.
So, but also I think one of the issues though about a neighborhood is, you know, one of the things that you've talked about is this idea that you have to build this community on this reciprocity of trust.
Yep.
And we are in a period of time in our history as a nation where people don't trust each other. I mean, let alone they can't even talk to each other. So how does that impact or influence, and where do you think we're going? Like, where do you think where we're headed now is going to influence how we think about our communities and neighborhoods?
I don't know where we're going. The problem with trust is it requires repetition.
Right.
The problem is we haven't figured out quite yet in a virtual context how to provide predictable repetition.
Right.
And I think that's one of the primary issues and the primary benefit of a neighborhood, a physical neighborhood, is that those shared amenities, my park, my school, my library, my butcher, you name it, we put possessive language on that because we share it. And those platforms of sharing those amenities is where we would frequently run into people and have these repetitive interactions. And that's how you build a reputation. That's how you build the framework for trust. Shifting all that conversation away from accidentally running into someone into a destination economy where the average Hoosier lives somewhere north of 6 miles away from toilet paper. Right? You don't have these casual, unplanned interactions. The ones we are having are through virtual channels, and they are built around the ability to eliminate the need for reputation. If I don't like somebody, I unfollow them.
Right.
They disappear from the planet. They're gone. If I'm offended by someone, cancel culture takes care of it, and that disappears forever. We don't have to reconcile the downward side of this repetition, and our reputations don't have to survive the stress that real relationships impose on people. And we're losing that skill set. And that skill set, I think, is one of the core tenets to what makes a good neighborhood. It's not all sunshine and roses. It's not intended to be perfect. It's intended to be in flux, in constant flux, by people that have an invested ownership in the territory, the geographic area.
Right.
And the second you game that system where you don't have to feel that stress or maybe that discomfort, I don't think you're doing any favors for the larger community.
But do you also think that a lot of times, I don't look at these new developments that are happening everywhere where they're, a developer buys a land and then they create these homes, and to me that's not a neighborhood.
Right.
I mean, to me that's like a artificial development, or it's like a gated community in a sense.
Yep.
That they're not, they don't have the necessary amenities to even be thought of as a neighborhood. So when most people think of neighborhoods, they think of like what would be in an urban type of downtown setting. And so now we have this whole issue of the suburban versus, where do the suburbs start? And, I think that part of that problem is that developers need to rethink how they create developments, because they don't even have, they don't even.
Or cities incentivize developments.
Okay, so explain to me how that works.
It's more of a systemic conversation.
Okay.
Tax abatements, standard conventional development incentives, really in most, if not all situations, don't tend to have a prescriptive opinion on what this development would do to a neighborhood, creating a neighborhood, improving a neighborhood, sustaining the resiliency of a neighborhood. And I think the future iteration of what those developments need to become is ones that are more sensitive to not only incentivizing developments for development's sake,
right,
and patting ourselves on the back that we got something built, but trying to understand what kind of everyday routine and quality of life that development's going to impose on anyone that lives within those limits.
Okay.
I think that is the future of developmental incentives, but that has to be somewhere where developers and municipalities meet in the middle and not one or the other.
Well, but don't you think that's partly because as a developer, you need to buy a large plot of land to build or to create the lots so that you can sell them. So you really have to move farther and farther away, sort of from an urban core, to find
Site control is always the issue.
right
Yes, for
that
sure.
kind of land, unless you're going to do a vertical kind of neighborhood, in a sense, a building.
Yeah.
So so how do we combat that, though? Because, like, I've talked to you about that. I've been looking at how to take some of these empty lots that are on Southeast, but they're not. It's not like a whole block, or it's not even. It's one lot on this block and one on that block, and there's no way to sort of think about how to help the neighborhoods in those sense, because it's not that easy. It's much easier to build, to just take a huge plot of land and just create a development.
For a developer.
Right.
Developers have to operate under a certain minimum scale. The rest of the world doesn't have that luxury.
Right.
So I do think it's, I'm not dodging your question, but the answer is it's not that simple. I think the discussion about municipalities and developers meeting in the middle has everything to do with a shared pursuit of site control and some framework to define what success looks like.
Okay.
And that doesn't always happen. Separate but parallel to that is setting up a framework in which individuals, non-developers, can maintain and operate their own neighborhoods in some sovereign way.
Okay.
And we've lost a sense of that as well. No one, I do a lot of work in rural communities. My favorite thing about rural small towns is it's a good and bad thing. Usually 1 to 3 people can make any idea happen or kill it overnight. There's a small number of people, and everyone in that town knows who those 3 people are.
Okay.
That used to be the case for every neighborhood. Every neighborhood had a self-appointed mayor, right?
Right.
Someone that was just in charge, kept up with everybody, made sure that if people were sick or there was a funeral or food was sent to the house, there was a manager of this. That ability to incentivize and maybe even train people to be these, I've seen programs call them block managers, where they're kind of the last iteration of a council person.
Right.
They're in charge of helping maintain and operate a 3-block area.
Well, don't we have these like neighborhood associations?
We do, but like I think everything else, they've now become authoritarian restrictions and guidelines, as opposed to being more interested in social capital and prioritizing emotional intelligence. They've now become, for the most part, there's some examples that I think do a better job than others. Neighborhood associations have been the checks and balances to make sure that ordinances are followed.
Right.
My grass is cut.
Right.
There's not a trailer in the front yard. They're there to protect you from that. They're not designed, I think, strictly as a mechanism to make sure everyone is okay. And there is a difference there. And that's where I think this virtual communication and the evolution of our group identity is in a lot of ways made us less empathetic to the everyday challenges of our neighbors, our physical neighbors.
Well, I also think that, it sort of parlays into this whole idea I want to talk to you about home. But I have this whole issue when people always say, well, my family is the most important to me. And so what I feel like they're doing then is saying that their immediate family, like their wife and their kids or their significant other, that's it. That's who's the most important to me, and not necessarily those beyond that, sort of the 4 walls of our house. So I think that that's not a good thing when people say that it's, just the sense of their family. But it didn't used to always be that way when you even look at the, let's talk about the history of homes in a sense, and how the sense of a home was developed, and how that also influences then the development and creation of neighborhoods.
You can read a litany of research on what home means, or watch the first 6 minutes to the movie Up, and probably land in the same spot. To me, I prescribe to the notion that how we self-identify with what home is, whatever home is the overlap of our cohabitants, the structure itself, and the context around it. All three of which are always changing. And that's why that opening scene of Up is so great. It's kind of just quick evolution of
his life, because his wife
and
died.
he marries
and,
and they have a miscarriage, and then she
Right.
dies. And all through that journey, it was home,
Right,
but never once was it the same.
right.
But it very much was home. And that's where I think we have lost some of our sense of what that really means. The evolution of home is pretty recent. Home and how we understand it now.
Right.
In the late 1600s, it was common that a normal home would have 22 to 25 people in it. The bedroom wasn't even invented till like 1680 something. Then the Dutch came in and invented this idea of a front porch and flipped the organization of a home upside down, zoned it for nighttime activities, daytime activities. The porch became the semi-private zone from public to private. All these things were evolved structures within the home to help us become better neighbors
Right.
in a lot of ways.
In some way, yeah.
Yeah. Until
Really the 20th century, right?
the automobile.
Right. Well, because so in the 18th and 19th century, you had this idea of this era of comfort.
Yeah.
Right. So that was the idea of like when the kitchen sort of, because it used to be outside of the house,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
that came into the house. And then you had, instead of everybody living like Little House on the Prairie in one room,
Right.
you had the rooms, and so it was the idea that there was comfort into making it the home itself, so the physical structure. So and then you also, that was the time when also you start to have the kitchen as that focal
Correct.
point when you brought it into the house. So then that was really the evolution. So and then in the 20th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, you talk about this era of efficiency,
Yep.
right? So that was the idea that everything in the home to make things easier for people to do, and that's when we got air conditioning and
The home
things
became
like
a
that.
machine. We just got better and better at making it more efficient.
Right.
It used to be a lot of work to operate a home.
Yeah.
I mean, it took an entire staff. And then there was this pocket of innovation where easy bake ovens and vacuum cleaners and the whole
Well, and TV dinners.
everything was
and
about
yeah.
efficiency.
Yeah.
And I think that was the beginning of us really changing how we interact with each other socially.
Because that was then became the era of autonomy, right? That I could have,
Yeah.
and that also became the time when your size of your house also became representative of your success.
I think so.
Yeah.
I do. There seems to be this American ideal that the more things you can privatize, the more successful you are.
Well, they said, so what they talked about was this idea that this upscaling of the
Yeah.
single family house, so since the 1980s. But even though they said that people have been making their houses larger, they're not necessarily happier, because what also happens is that they start comparing the size of their house to the other houses on their block. So it sort of becomes this cycle of upcycling, becomes this cycle of one-upmanship.
Yeah.
And so we became like because
Yeah.
they were saying from 1980 to 2009, the size of the largest 10% of homes increased 1.4 times faster than the size of the intermediate home.
Yep.
And that also continues to perpetuate wealth inequality. But like in 1973, the medium-sized home was just over 1,500 square feet. In 2015, it was 2,500
With
square
half
feet.
the amount of occupants.
Right,
Yeah.
because they said that
Yeah.
in 1973, per resident, it was 507 square feet. In 2015, it's 971 square feet per resident. But that also created this autonomy, not only from the people outside the house, but even the people in the house. Because now, not only does everybody have their own TV, they might have their own wing, they have their own bathroom. I mean, so you even have this sense of independence and autonomy within your own home.
Yeah.
Or like when people, have to text their kids to
Yes.
find
Right.
out what
Oh,
they're
right.
doing. So what does all that mean, though, and where are we now? Because with COVID, I think even before, I definitely felt that we were in more of a shareable, like with car share or,
Yeah.
or being able to call a Lyft or an Uber or even rent the runway where you could rent an outfit or, you didn't have to own everything.
Yep.
But then with COVID now, because, restaurants are closed and movie theaters are closed, and gyms, now we've entrenched back into this whole sense of autonomy and we have to protect ourselves. So what has that done to us in terms of trying to build a neighborhood or, where we're going to go from there?
I don't know how productive the pandemic is. I do have a hope that it illustrated to people just how important their social interactions were that I think pre-pandemic they took for granted. They I think largely thought that going to restaurants fun and entertaining, and not coming to grips with the fact that they really struggle without being around people.
Right.
And they don't understand how much they struggle, or how much of a benefit just being around other people really is. And when that all went away, what felt like overnight, I think for a lot of people, I hope that was a wake-up call that it wasn't just because I like the food at the restaurant. I really need, not want, I need to be around other people. And that's, I hope, the lesson that a lot of communities can learn coming out of this and not take it for granted. That being said, we have to, to hammer every problem looks like a nail. So this is from an architect. I think we also have to try to understand how we can retrofit the built environment to encourage these interactions. Like when you talk about that home and texting your kid to find them, they also have, in most cases, no likelihood of looking out a window and seeing another kid. And that connection to the outside world is as important as my connection to my parents within the home. Just to feel completely isolated in that way, not only from my parents, but from the world. It's ironic that we've done this and then in the same breath surprised that the incoming generation doesn't know how to talk to one another. You can't have it both ways. And I'm not convinced that the American dream should be so reliant on independence. We tend to be social animals that are solely reliant on depending on others. And the second we forget that, I think we get upside down.
Well, isn't that the idea of the village effect? That so Susan Pinker, great. So talk about that and how, what that means for.
So Susan Pinker wrote I thought a really interesting book about the village effect on not only longevity, like how long people live, like blue zone type,
and the livability,
But what may be most interesting is there's a whole list of research on what are the common traits or strategies to reduce the likelihood of premature death. And typical things, smoking, drinking, obesity, medication. The top two ways to reduce those chances were, and I'm going to get the language wrong, social relationships and close connections. So I always rephrase them as bonding and bridging relationships. So like they're the two tenets of social capital. Outperform all other indicators. And they're very different when you're in a really great place. They tend to be places that these two things happen at the same time. So bridging networks are your kind of social network of folks. And that tends to be the platform for opportunity. If you need a doctor, your cousin's sister's friend knows a guy. And that's how you find a physician. And it's usually the best indicator to see how a generation can get out of poverty, is their exposure to a broader bonded network, a bridge network. The other one's bonded network. These are close friends, like really close, like the ones that would actually take you to the airport. Like real friends.
At 4 a.m. and you won't say anything.
Real friends. And those we find are really hard to develop and maintain virtually.
Well, they're hard to maintain as adults anyway.
But this idea that I can still remain best friends, across the country, You can try, but it's extremely difficult. And that idea, and Susan's book really focuses on the clinical benefits of physical social interaction.
So in some ways, though, and you've done a lot of work, your firm, with looking at both health care facilities and then for senior living.
Yeah.
So in some ways, I think that we've gotten this a little bit better with senior living, like with the pocket neighborhoods, or even realizing that we should really have these mixed use kind of communities where you have people of all ages, or that people, like there's a daycare center in the in the senior center, in the senior living, so that then there's the interaction and that kind of thing. But we haven't made that transition to like where young families would live, to create that sort of sense of pocket neighborhoods, and then they could have, where then the kids, like when like Jane Jacobs talks about, when you look at someone on the street, there was always someone looking down to see what the kids were all doing and sitting on the stoop. And why do you think, though, that we haven't, we create this artificial sense of these pocket neighborhoods. They're not really in a real neighborhood. But why do you think that we can't make that transition to recognize how to create those within a real existing neighborhood, in a sense?
I think partly because we don't seem to care if we really understand what people are looking for in communities. I think a lot of people say they know, and then don't get challenged for it being really one-dimensional. So whenever you say, well, this is a great place to raise a family, I don't know what that means. I really don't. And people say it all the time, and no one criticizes it. Or need a safe community. I don't know what that means either. I don't know if this is still true, but it probably is. I know it was in 2010. There's always higher nonviolent crime in gated communities. Always. You took a neighborhood and promised the entire world that everyone lives here is affluent. If you're going to steal something, here's where you should
concentration.
come. Here's where you come.
Yeah.
The reason they're so unsafe for nonviolent activity not only is because it's a concentrated area, but because there's no diversified usage of time and schedule, which is largely the best way to predict a safe environment. People coming and going all the time in an unpredictable fashion.
Because there's somebody always watching.
You never know.
But you also built, like in a real neighborhood, you build places for economic growth to happen and for business exchange to happen. And in these artificial kinds of developments and gated communities, they don't even have that. You have to get, it's not within, like you have a living space and then you have the commercial space. It's not this fluidity, and I think that hurts us.
And I think it's an outgrowth of us not reconciling all we know about evolutionary biology and humans and how they interact, and how we're encouraging or demanding cities to evolve. This idea of inclusionary zoning, Euclidean zoning, single-use zoning, where you say, you live over here, you work over here, the park's over here. We did that. We imposed that structure on ourselves with, I think, an obvious misunderstanding of how humans actually interact. Because I think it simplified what seemed like a really complex system.
Well, and I think that also was because it was really top down. It was sort of like a small group of people who sort of thought, this is how, if somebody lives in a downtown environment, this is how they would live, or what it should be like.
Well, it spawned out of the last global pandemic. That's where it came from.
Because if you if you really look at how the modern bathroom design was created, it was actually because of the pandemic in 1918, and that also influenced, people don't realize, also how kitchens and the whole design, but it really influenced bathrooms.
So the plague, they quarantined off the city, and that quickly evolved into modern day zoning. And it was done for a reason, but almost in a disaster relief context, not as in a prescriptive way for a community to look at the next 20 years of healthy growth. And then when the Garden City movement came, it became a way to protect largely affluent families from the unhealthy side effects of city living, because industry was the core
the
tenet.
Pollution,
And now what's ironic to me is cities aren't relying on that pollution as their economic engine. And now we're doing the exact opposite of trying to understand how we can fix the suburbs because of how unhealthy they are to live in.
Right.
Psychologically.
Right. And they're not, I mean, there's that whole perception of that the suburbs are affluent. They're not. I mean, but that's that eradication between the urban and suburban kind of.
They never really were. They were segregated. They weren't affluent.
Right. But I mean, what concerns me though is like when you look at it as an architect or work with developers, you have this sort of, you look at the psychology and the sociology. But so when I hear about this huge development that they want to do in the southeast, and they show you this pretty rendering, and it's houses and little streets, and okay, it looks pretty, but it's isolating in the sense that there's no interaction with commerce or business, and so it makes first that assumption that everybody has to have a car. It doesn't incorporate, like you don't see it how it works within the public, transportation grid, and it also makes the assumption that only a certain type of people will live there, and that is partly because of how they get tax incentives or to.
And that's where this gets complicated. You're not going to attract a developer unless there's a housing study. The housing study has to support the market rate and economic demand of a certain population.
Right.
And that's where the private sector has to meet in the middle. Where I think the focus of city leadership, and I haven't seen the plan, is to try as best you can to use those development strategies as a way to systematically improve what Jane Jacobs would call multiplicity of choice.
Right.
That choice is the currency, not the bricks and mortar square footage. What you're trying to do is create a system, a platform, of which you're providing more choices for more different types of people. If you can do that, it tends to evolve in a way that these people across all different kinds of demographics can plug and play on their own terms. And that, to me, is the responsibility of a city, in an academic sense.
Right.
Is trying to increase choice. So that's why public transit is so important.
Right.
Is it provides that choice, and it's not just for low-income families.
No, it should be for anybody.
And it is.
But the problem is like if you do a study of CityLink, and I don't know when the last time that those routes and things have been looked at and changed.
Right.
But if you overlay them today, because I've done it on the sort of grid of where development is happening and stuff, they don't make sense anymore.
Right.
And so it's sort of like they don't go to where people, I mean, it could take you, based on the bus route, it could take you an hour to go somewhere that would take you 15 minutes in a car.
And these systems have become so rigid.
Right.
The inertia to change them is why Uber was so successful. It's exponentially more choice. Right? I just need an app, and anywhere, anytime, probably could find somebody to come get me. It's the reason bridge networks are so important. I have that multiplicity of choice. I have 100 people that could come pick me up, at the end of a night if I needed them, or one Uber contact.
Right.
But if I'm relying on a bus system and I'm nowhere near a line, I have no choice. So I probably won't interact in those areas that are restricted by that choice. And that, to me, is usually a smaller part of the discussion because it's so hard to define for a lot of folks, and it's not exciting.
So do you also think though that we need to rethink how our city government is structured? Like I was thinking about, because if you talk about that, you think that the sort of governance for a neighborhood should be on the grassroots local level. So then I was thinking, well, does our city councilman and district kind of structure still work or be relevant to that? Because then you're not necessarily, looking at the.
That's a good question.
And then I also think that maybe would that then also change this whole idea of how we fund school, like property taxes, and that, and and then values, and what the assessments are and things. Is there also a disconnect between because I just feel like sometimes we're still trying to put this square peg in a round hole, like with these developments. Like what surprised me in this area on the southeast side where they're looking to build this development, like I thought, okay, well there should be, you hear about mixed use buildings all the time that's going to be downtown, but why isn't there any mixed use, like a place for a little grocery store or dry cleaner or a little coffee shop within this? Because it's going to have, some of these are going to have like 200 dwellings from all different things. Would that be enough to support it? But we don't think that way.
I think the biggest hurdle is a narrow-minded definition of cost. Like there are real reasons why a larger single school is more efficient and economically cheaper than 4 neighborhood schools, right? Totally, there's a financial reason why that is more efficient for taxpayers. Until you lump in all the social issues around that, or the fact that if you walk to school as a child, you will score higher on your SAT score. Right, but that's not part of the cost discussion.
No. I walked to school.
Right,
But then there was the whole issue of busing that came up too.
But that's real cost to the community at large.
Right.
But it makes it even more complicated than it already is. But those costs, I think, is where we need additional leadership. My immediate reaction to your question is, I don't know if we need to completely restructure the council person, mayor, job responsibility, job description.
Right.
But I do think, especially in communities, cities of our size, the ones that are going to really thrive over the next 20 years are the ones that are really going to start to take an innovative approach to understanding what cost really means.
And you worked on that with in Bloomington, right? Is that where you worked?
Through a grant.
Through the grant. And so tell me a little bit about that project and how's it going? Like, what have they been finding, or, in terms of creating, because what they were trying to do was create more of what was a living community in a sense.
So the grant was the description of what we were charged to try to think through was understanding what a prototype for a community of all ages and abilities look like. And it was pretty open-ended of what that could be. What the work we did in Bloomington was try to explore how you could change development incentives in a way that you could insulate yourself from the problems demographic shifts would cause you in 20 years. So better way to say that is Indiana's older adult population is growing rapidly.
Right.
So easy example would be, I only would give you a tax abatement if you can show me objectively how you could make the city more livable for an older adult. If you can do that, then you qualify for these incentives. If not, no harm, no foul. We're not going to say you can't do what you want to do, but we're only going to invest in ourselves and try to make sure that we don't paint ourselves in a corner. Because if I just do this without looking ahead of what the trajectory of the demographic is going to impose on the built environment, then I'm going to be caught in a really bad spot 15 to 20 years from now. So it was trying to understand, and I don't know how successful it was an academic exercise to try to better understand, well, what could that structure look like? Could it be a scorecard? Could it be a livability index that the developments over a certain price point would have to be able to prove they're contributing towards improving a score or livability to qualify for incentives? And I do think that's a likely evolution of what those incentives look like.
And where did Bloomington come out on it? Did they do anything with it, or?
I don't know. It turned into a planning exercise similar to what we've just done in Southeast for their downtown core. Now the question is, how does that translate into real bricks and mortar development? And this is where you need leadership. Now, are we willing to say no to something? That doesn't meet this criteria. That's the first, and they're not there yet, I don't think, but that's the first test is you're going to call the bluff of the first opportunity that arrives, and it always happens. But trying to understand where that line in the sand is, and do you have the leadership to hold it?
And do you think that in some ways we are doing this whole with the tax abatements and tax incentives a disservice to ourselves because of that fact. Like, when you look at even what they're doing with the bakery, right, to create that home for the Fort Wayne Philharmonic, they're really doing that with tax incentives. So I didn't understand exactly how that works. So they got, it's partly, like I know developers that they have to give a certain percentage of the development costs, like for the public art. Okay, so we have that. But I don't really understand, how does this tax, because I think that I was surprised that the Philharmonic a lot of that is going to be done through tax incentives.
Yeah, sort of. I think it's difficult to change because you can only change it at the local level, but those development incentives let you compete with other cities.
Right.
So you can't be the first one and theoretically the only one to say, well, we're going to stop doing this. There's a lot of research to see that it's a zero-sum game, but you got to kind of play that game until there's more of a systemic shift. My stance is I'm not against the philosophy of that, but it's no different than like when we do work with some communities, they'll complain about their zoning ordinances like they're not self-imposed rules. Like, you all came up with these rules and voted to maintain them.
Right.
Then if you don't like them, change them. The tax abatement, I think, is going to be a persistent incentive because other communities will continue to do it. The question is, at a local level, what do we want to require for those that receive these funds? And look what we did with the Public Art Commission. Right. You can do whatever you want, as long as a certain percentage of us agree that that's the right way to go. The lit for Riverfront. We can structure this in a way that we can define what success looks like in the future. But I would really strongly encourage us to look at how we're defining cost and benefit. And I think it is going to have to acknowledge the fact that these decisions are our only way out of repairing this epidemic of loneliness, and there's an enormous cost associated with that.
Right, because then they show that the health costs that are associated
enormous.
And I think also we're going to have a bigger problem because now that with the whole COVID crisis, the impact that we're going to see on budgets, I mean, they've already talked about cutting the community development budget. And even with school budgets. I mean, and that's going to be not for 2021, but you're going to see that 2022 and 2023. So, I mean, is that going to keep us to not being able to look at these different innovative ways of trying to think about redevelopment or? Oh no,
if anything, I think it gives us I think it gives us some time and some urgency. No, to me, that's, if one good thing comes out of this, it's that, is you got a fast-forwarded, exaggerated example of how detrimental loneliness can be to the economy, not in community or neighborhood, the economy. How can we better prepare ourselves to be more resilient against this, knowing that in the next 20 years, our senior population is going to grow by 130%. We're behind. We need to understand how, at a structural level, we can be more resistant to the side effects of loneliness in a way that makes sense from an economic development standpoint.
Well, I was thinking that also because, I mean, you do a lot of work in senior living, but after COVID, nobody is going to want to go to a nursing home or assisted living facility in the structure that they are now.
Well, but only 4% of them were in the first place.
Right. So I was thinking, well, maybe we're going to see more of those sort of InLaw Suites, or you know, where instead of having like a standalone garage, you're going to create like a tiny house. But there's also issues about zoning and ordinances about like it's very easy to be able to build a 2,500 square foot house, even on a lot that may not necessarily warrant it. But you cannot, to build anything like under 900 square feet is very difficult.
Yeah, and mother-in-law suites on most of the time don't meet a city's ordinance.
Right. Yeah. And then also the idea of having it where it's sort of you build up where you can have it's 2 apartments,
Right.
so the grandmother lives in the bottom, and then upstairs. You can't. That's very difficult
Correct.
as well in a lot of
cities.
Right.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think that maybe those are kinds of things we're going to have to change and think about. But I don't know if we are sort of think about how that's going to impact.
Well, then, there are some. I don't think people understand the urgency of it. These things don't happen overnight. But in urban planning terms, we're going to have a deficit of that type of housing tomorrow, and we won't move fast enough to prepare for it. And that's where I think we're going to need to have a better understanding of what types of neighborhoods and social systems we need to put in place. The idea that a third of adults in this country are classified as caregivers.
Right.
Your housing policy has to embrace that fact.
Right.
That is a fact.
Yeah, like no, in where I went to college in Somerville, Massachusetts, they still have a law in the books that 3 women who are unrelated cannot live in the same house.
Yeah, Golden Girls. Exclusion.
Yeah, you can't. Yeah, it's
Right.
they thought that would constitute a brothel.
Right.
So I mean, they still haven't changed
Correct. There's a Golden Girls exclusion in a lot of zoning ordinances, which is just crazy to me that we're not thinking of how that could empower choice for
right.
people.
And for a lot of widows, that's what they do. That's because they pool their resources and they. But we're not thinking about any of that. I mean, so how do we get to start to think about how to create these? It's like I was thinking, even if you sort of have those like the third space where that people live. But so I was thinking, well, let's take the landing, for instance, where you have the retail space on the bottom and then you have the 2 floors of apartments. But maybe in some you have to put some first floor apartments so that then those would be where the elderly could live, and then you could have the younger people, because they also are saying that it's not good just like it's not good to put all your low-income housing in one area, it's not good to put all your senior housing in one area. You want to have this multi-generational and sort of mixed. So, but I mean, in some ways, though, if you look at it, because in the landing, because in 2 buildings, there's stairs. So, I mean, so we're doing it. We're not thinking about it because, again, the cost or the real estate of that.
Monocultures are dangerous for a lot of reasons. Having the same type of
right, and even people who want to only live with people like themselves, who think like themselves.
In the mid-'80s, there's a term that got popular called naturally occurring retirement communities. They call them NORCs.
Yeah.
They started, the first one that I know of was in New York, and it was an intergenerational residential tower. Coming from someone that grew up in a 1-stoplight small town in Indiana, it sounds like a euphemism for a normal neighborhood, right? I mean, neighborhoods and small towns were naturally occurring retirement communities to begin with.
Right. Well, that's what happened with Miami Beach.
Yeah,
because
right.
it was, so what happened with Miami Beach is that it became a retirement community, and then as those homeowners died off, because they didn't do a lot to their homes, then the younger families were able to buy those homes at really good prices, and then they redid them, and now those owners are becoming empty nesters. So now there's the issue of, are they going to stay there or not, and then what's going to be now, but their kids can't afford to live there, but they do go through these.
It still happens in these kind of monoculture waves, right? It's one type of person for half a generation.
Right. Because you only have a huge concentration of that type of person, where you don't have the ebb and flow and the mixture of people at different, sort of stages in their life.
I mean, one way to say it is retirement communities were a proposed solution for inefficient cities. Like, it was a solution to a problem.
Right.
It wasn't a preference. It was, here's the issue. We'll solve it with more inclusionary zoning.
Right.
We'll put those people over here and take care of them. And that's why it only appeals to 4 to 5% of the market.
Right.
Now, nursing is a different issue, on that campus. But when you're talking about independent living, senior living, those 55-plus community type.
No, because if you had a neighbor who would check, if they didn't see you around the building, for 2 days, then it's the same thing as you having to press a button every morning.
But that's to our first question. That is the power of repetition.
Right.
Right? I need to have those interactions on a regular basis so that you notice when you haven't seen me in 3 days.
Well, that's why I always say that why people make their closest friendships and it's easiest to make friends in college, because you do see people, like you go to class the same way and you see this person and then you see the same people in the cafeteria. It's sort of like that we create this sort of in a bubble environment for that to happen.
And social media never changed that.
No.
School is still the primary source of creating friendships.
Yes. Yeah.
No matter generation.
No, and it can be diverse groups
Yeah.
of individuals.
Yeah.
Well, of course, we didn't get to, you'll have to come back for a third time.
I'm sorry.
But as you know, usually at the end of each show, I ask the same 12 questions that French novelist Marcel Proust popularized. However, you've already answered my original 12. So I have now come up with another baker's dozen that Proust also believed that by answering these, they would reveal your true nature. So you're the first who's going to answer my second set of questions. What is your idea of perfect happiness?
Contributing.
What is your greatest fear?
Oh, geez. Losing my wife.
What is the trait you most deplore in yourself?
Overconfidence.
Which living person do you most admire?
Living? Warren Buffett. Oh, Charlie Munger.
That's someone who really knows the...
Charlie Munger.
Right. What is your greatest extravagance?
Books.
What is your current state of mind?
It's Friday. Relaxed.
On what occasion do you lie?
Not often. When my preteen sons talk about girls.
Which word or phrases do you most overuse?
It's all relative.
What talent would you most like to have?
Play harmonica.
What is your most treasured possession?
Books.
What do you most value in your friends?
Honesty.
What is your greatest regret?
Not having one.
Well, that's pretty good. If you were to die and come back as a person or a thing, what would it be?
Oh, geez. Person or a thing? Fountain pen.
Oh, you like with the ink?
Yeah.
Well, okay. That says a lot. Also, by the time period, we could dive into that one.
It's like you're on a couch.
Right. So you'll promise me that you'll come back in early 2021 so we can talk about schools. And I also want to talk to you about some of the projects that you've done in 2020, where they are and how they're progressing.
Okay.
So you'll come back.
Yes, promise.
Okay. And you can please join me next time when you can again enjoy a seat at the table for great conversation and good company.